Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on what part of the world you're in. My name is Justin Baxley. I'm the Retail Product Manager at PDI, and we're here to talk today about ordering, suggested ordering in Enterprise 8 and the different things that are available to you. Obviously, in an hour-long webinar, we're not in a position to talk to you about every single possible facet of the new and advanced ordering system that we've put together for you guys. But I want to make sure that now that we're sitting here about 6 months out from general release, that you guys are available or aware of the available tools to you. So what we're going to do is go through at a pretty high level, but want to make sure that we give you the basic familiarity with the key components that you need to know are available for you when you guys start looking at what you can get with Enterprise 8. One of the things, real quick, just as a housekeeping note, if you guys missed any of the introductory notes from Austin, if you guys have questions that come up in the course of this, what I want you to do is go ahead and enter those in the chat window. Austin's going to keep track of those, and towards the end of the session, he's going to go ahead and feed me some questions. To the extent that we can go ahead and get to those questions, we will. Any questions that we got to postpone, we'll make sure we follow up with you guys directly to make sure that all the questions are answered coming out of this. Now, as we start to talk through this, one of the things we got to talking about is we said we really want to make sure that everybody understands what our objectives are as we start to go through this ordering process. One of the key objectives that we're after is really just trying to get to a place where there's three sort of interrelated things that suggested ordering is going to improve for you. As we start to talk through those three main benefits are going to start out with probably the most important objective that we've all got in our businesses. In retail convenience, we sell stuff. We're trying to sell things, and we're trying to increase those sales so we can increase our profitability. So one of our main objectives in suggested ordering is to try and increase your sales. Now, these different benefits are going to kind of build on each other a little bit. One of the ways we're going to increase sales is we're going to reduce your out-of-stocks. So one of our objectives here is that we'll make sure that when somebody comes in to buy something, the things that they're trying to buy are on the shelf and available for them to buy. We also want to make sure that if in the course of a normal ordering cycle we've actually increased demand and so we've consumed more than we normally have, that we're in a position to meet that increased demand so that you can, again, continue to increase your sales. So we want to increase those sales, we want to reduce the out of stock, and somewhere in the middle between meeting the most demand possible and never running out of stock, there's this sweet spot where our inventory is at the appropriate level. And so really sort of the third objective is kind of, cooperates with those other objectives we're after, which is optimizing your inventory levels. Now for some folks, the first thing you think of is reducing your inventory levels, and that is going to be something that a lot of people see is that as you take advantage of this computer suggested ordering, that you really see a reduction in certain inventory levels. But we really like to think of it more as you have the right amount of the right things. So for some items, that means we're going to see a reduction in inventory and therefore a reduction in the capital that's tied up in inventory. For other things, we may actually see a slight increase in inventory levels because those particular items maybe we've been keeping at a lower stock level than is appropriate for their normal demand and sales. But those are the three things that we're really after. Is how do we increase our sales? How do we reduce those out of stock so we don't miss sales? And then ultimately, how do we get our inventory to that perfect place where we're going to meet the demand without being in this position where we've got a lot of dollars tied up in our inventory levels? Well, let's talk about what Enterprise 8 is going to bring to the table to make that happen. One of the first things that you're going to see on my list here is this idea of getting to the most accurate forecast possible. So one of the first things we're going to talk about today is the ways in which the forecast in Enterprise 8 is going to add a much more accuracy to your ability to predict what sales are going to look like in the near future. That's important because obviously the first thing we want to do is meet the sales that are coming up in the next ordering cycle, but it's also important because we can intelligently determine minimum stock levels and help you optimize your inventory levels based on that kind of normal performance of a given item. So it plays kind of a double role. And we're going to talk about how do we get to a better forecast in the first place. Second thing is real-time inventory, and we talked more about that in that last webinar about the handheld. Obviously with Enterprise 8, one of our prime objectives is get you to a place where the inventory that you've got in the books, your picture of what your current inventory levels look like reflects what's actually on the ground, the physical reality going on in your stores, and does so at a speed that matches pace with the normal processes of business in your store. So if we've got deliveries coming in and increasing inventory, we want to make sure we capture that. If we've got conditions that we know indicate that our on-hand is inaccurate, we want to go ahead and get an exception count out there and fix that stuff. Lots of tools there with the prime focus of getting your inventory as accurate as possible, but with the end game of saying, if we've got a better picture of what your on-hand is, then when we do that comparison to say, this is what our on-hand looks like at delivery, this is what our on-hand ought to look like at delivery, we can do a better job. Today we're going to talk more on the other side of that picture, which is, okay, how do we help you set intelligently the appropriate levels so we can take advantage of that real-time on-hand and turn that into a stock adjustment that's going to make a more meaningful suggested order. Ultimately, the other thing that we wanted to sort of add on here and talk about a little bit is automation. Because as we start to go through a suggested ordering process, we can produce the best order calculation possible, but if folks aren't executing well, if they're not getting those orders done and those orders aren't getting delivered to our vendors, then it's irrelevant how quality that calculation is. So I want to talk a little bit about the tools we give you in Enterprise 8 to help make sure that those orders are executed and they're executed on time, and then ultimately they get delivered to the vendor on time as well. So one of the other things that we want to talk about here is, as we start to go into each of these pieces, is we want to actually talk about that sales forecast and how are we going to get you the best forecast possible across a wide range of items that face really a lot of unique constraints and concerns. I want to talk mainly about 3 kinds of items first, and how do we get to a better base forecast in Enterprise 8 for each of those types of items. Then I want to talk about some of the components that we can roll into all of our forecasts for all kinds of items to make sure that the forecast is more accurate to deal with different things that may be happening in your store. So first of all, I want to talk about those standard items and how do we get to a base forecast that's of really high quality. The first things first is we're all in the same system with all your inventory transactional data. We're not worrying about potential lags as we sort of sync up between sales that are going on in your inventory system, your back office system, and this system somewhere else that does all your ordering for you. It's all living in the same house. So we can get to the absolute freshest data possible. And I say fresh because it really, it's kind of hot off the press. We're capturing the transactions here using the overall enterprise inventory management system. We get the ability to immediately hit those transactions and consume them. That's a shift to some degree even from the 3.7 world. And I want to point out one clear thing. In 3.7, a lot of that data that we were consuming came out of the item inventory stuff, and we had to kind of go through the DRU process before we could access it. We've moved to a direction that said, look, if it's in the system and I can see an item sale in paperwork, that should be something I can consume to help you get a better picture of what sales are going to look like in the future. For standard items, most of the time, that's just that sales transaction. And we're looking by day of week, by item, by site, what does a normal Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday look like in terms of sales for a given item. Now there's some other items that as we start to work through this, that we might have some different concerns about how to forecast those. So for a standard item, I don't necessarily need to see my item inventory history get updated. I don't necessarily need to see anything except item sales. And as long as I've got those item sales, I can give you the best sales forecast possible or consumption forecast possible. But when I start talking about something like food service, I get into a little bit of a different quandary. In food service, there's several other factors that may come into play. I may produce food service items for my site as well as produce those to transfer over here to another site. I may take certain portions of items and consume those in different ways. Coffee bars, not quite food service, but kind of a comparable kind of cost inventory area where we say, hey, look, I've got milk over here that I sell out the door, but I also consume that either through a transfer out or through an adjustment type. I've got supply type items that I might sell, but also you consume for store use. So there's other factors in places like food service or those kinds of dispensed beverage contexts where we can start to use other types of transaction to produce a better picture of what normal consumption looks like. What does that mean? At the end of the day, that forecast is not just what sales are going on, but it's an ability to predict ways in which items are being consumed, because if we're consuming them and they're being sold either in a transformed way like in food service or like the coffee bar, or we're consuming them to transfer out to another store, ultimately that's part of something we need to replace as part of our ordering algorithm. The other thing in food service that I wanted to make really clear, we have the ability to identify the sales that come through something like a menu item. So if I take a menu item and I sell it out the door, I know what was in that menu item based on price book configuration. I can order those component ingredients in rhythm with the amount of consumption that's going on for those particular menu items. So if I sell a cheeseburger, I know I've technically also sold a bun, and I've technically also sold that burger patty, and I've also sold the cheese. And so those component sales, we capture those, we see those in that inventory tracking system. That means we've also got the ability to forecast them, which means we also have the ability to produce a pretty good forecast or order for those particular ingredient items. Just wanted to make it clear that that's something else we can forecast there. Now, one other layer of the forecast as we start to talk through it is that forecast assumes that you have a certain amount of history to work with. What we've added in Enterprise 8 is some ability to intercept those items that have been newly introduced or reintroduced after a period of inactivity, so that when we have a very minimal amount of history to work with, we can modify the forecast to deal with that. and arrive at a more conservative forecast representative of the amount of data that we have. So if I've had an item and it's been in my store for 3 days, I may not have a good picture of what every single Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday looks like, but I can identify that it's been in the store for a short period of time, adjust my calculation methods, and I won't get into the details now for that. We can definitely talk about it if you'd like to. But adjust my calculation methods and produce a solid forecast for those items with very minimal historical data. So 3 different ways, standard sort of 80% of my store that's going to buy in and sell out, I can forecast those sales and produce a really solid forecast based on the historical data that you're already capturing. Those food service items which have some special conditions and requirements, we have the ability to get to a very specific granularity around the kinds of transactions, the different kinds of transactions that contribute to the consumption of those items and produce a good forecast even if they're sold out as menu items. And those new items, we've got some flexibility to handle the challenges that come with those guys so that for all the items in your store, we can produce a really solid forecast. Now, as we go into this, one of the other things that we saw was that there were certain things that the freshest data, so to speak, didn't always give us the best forecast. We wanted to use that base forecast from the most recent historical data that you've got because hopefully, if your marketing and merchandising people are doing their jobs, this year doesn't look like last year. If we're all trying to push forward and do our jobs well and achieve what that prime objective is, which is selling convenience retail items, then this year shouldn't theoretically look like last year exactly. So we want to make sure we figure out what that current year baseline is. At the same time, the current year is not always going to be the most perfect picture of where we're heading in the future because some places have really extreme weather events that can affect our overall demand through the course of the year. Now I'm showing you a graphic here that I've shown, and you may have seen in some different contexts before, but I think it very clearly communicates what we're talking about here. You see those upright blue bars, those are total weekly sales for a given subcategory. And you see there's a pretty solid wave pattern to that. We see that as we come into the summer months, we see a really extreme increase in sales. Now, as we start to dig into it, there's a very sort of regular pattern over the years where we see an increase coming into the summer, we see a decrease coming into the fall. And if you look at the red line is what would we have forecasted if we were just keying off the current year by itself. And as you come into that demand season, you'll notice that high demand season, as we're coming into it, that current year forecast doesn't quite keep up with where actual demand is going. At the same time, as we come out of that high demand season into that slower season, that current year forecast is also always sort of over predicting what we think we're going to sell. We started asking the question how we could automatically, as part of our forecast calculation, help you guys figure out how to keep that current year baseline so that wherever your current performance level is, you're keeping that realistic. But at the same time, use those years worth of data that you've accumulated in that enterprise system to adjust that to account for that sort of exponential increase or decrease in demand. What we did then was we basically said, okay, we can create a weighted average adjustment over a lot of years worth of data, combine that with that really fresh current year baseline, and produce an overall better forecast. So as you look at that blue line, that's where we took that red line and we said, if we adjusted that based on everything we know about these past years, where would we have moved that red line? And you'll see that we moved it very close to where the blue actual bars are. So this is called a seasonal calculation, and it's part of the new forecasting engine. It's something that you can turn on. It's not a whole lot of extra work to maintain. In fact, our whole goal was to let those things happen basically like magic, so it wasn't something else that somebody had to keep up with. But it's got that ability to look back through the year's worth of history that you guys are already accumulating and come up with that adjustment. Now you may be looking at this graphic and you may see, hey, there's a couple spikes still sticking above the blue line. They're not quite there. What's the story there? Even if we look year over year, there's certain things that can happen that can skew the current year forecast in a way that we wouldn't have predicted, either based on kind of a generalized seasonal trend or based on your current year baseline. Those things may be related to holidays. They may be related to specific events that hit the store that seriously impact demand. They may be related to things like promotions. And in those cases, we built infrastructure to come in and additionally help you work with those as well. An event has really 2 main impacts. The first one is I'm looking forward to an event. Let's say, currently we just passed up 4th of July. When I was sitting in the last part of June and I wanted to figure out what Monday, July 4th was going to do to my store demand, I'm not going to predict that based on the way June has performed. I will never figure out how hot July 4th is going to be based just on what's going on in June. So I need to be able to anticipate the difference it's going to make in my forecast when I'm looking forward to it and trying to forecast what's going to happen on that day. But at the same time, here we are sitting, and next Monday will be one of the last Mondays in June, or July, I mean. And as we look at the last Mondays in July, they're not necessarily going to look anything like Monday, July 4th of this year. So we need a second sort of stage where we look back and we say, hey, you know, that Monday was different. I need it to not skew what my forecast looks like going forward. So it's kind of a two-direction concern with those sales forecast events. And we can do both. We can look forward and say, look, 4th of July is going to see a certain percentage of increase. But at the same time, as we pass 4th of July, I know that I need to sort of remove that impact from my forecast going forward because I don't want it to skew me up or down. We can use this for, like I said, holidays, events, and even promotions. Now, for something like 4th of July, something like a cigarette promotion, we started to ask the question, how do we get you guys out of the job of trying to figure out what that adjustment looks like? And we said, well, if we're going to try and make you guys figure that out, you'd go do a bunch of math looking at what? History. And say, what did 4th of July look like last year? Well, that history is already wound into the enterprise system. We know what 4th of July looked like last year. We know what your history looked like the last time you did that sales promotion on cigarettes. So we built in the ability in these sales forecast events to say, hey, the next time you run into this event, it looks a lot like the last time we had this event. So 4th of July this year looks like 4th of July last year. Again, it's an adjustment, so we can say, hey, if we're really kicking it this year and business is really booming, then from there I can assume that my booming business is going to grow a certain amount based on the fact that, you know, I've got 4th of July coming up. In the same way, maybe you're in the Dakotas and oil industry was really killing it 2 years ago and we've had more people than we've ever dreamed of having in the Dakotas. And then this year, all of a sudden, you know, oil prices being what they are, there's not a lot of folks running around, you know, buying a lot of stuff in my convenience stores, not a lot of those 18-year-olds in those $50,000 trucks anymore. What do? Well, we've got this year's baseline. We know what this year looks like. Now, last year, 4th of July might have been a 400% increase on a much higher number. This year it may be a 400% increase on a much lower number. But we've got the ability to identify what that impact looks like. For things like promotions, we run into something interesting and also very exciting. If I did a cigarette promotion in February, I can look at February and say, hey, when this cigarette promotion hit in February, we saw a 20% or a 30% increase in sales. That's great. So the first week I repeat that cigarette promotion again, I can reuse that adjustment and say, look, the last time we ran it, we saw about a 20 to 30%. That's what I'm going to adjust or expect to adjust for this year when we run the same promotion again. But promotions often run more than 1 or 2 weeks. So as we get to week 2 of a 4-week promotion, we can look back at week 1 and use that as a determining factor for what week 2 is going to look like. When we get to week 3, we can look at week 2 and week 1. When we get to week 4, we can look at week 3 and week 2 and week 1 and start to say not what did this do to our forecast back in February, but rather what is the difference between what our reality looks like and what our forecast is right now in the middle of this particular event. So those sales forecast events that span multiple weeks, we actually will adjust them on the fly based on how they're actually impacting real performance of the store at that time. So there we've got sort of 3 main things. How do we get to a better base forecast for all the items in your store regardless of the different challenges they face? 2, how do we account for those really extreme seasonal demand changes you get? Now, if you're down in Conroe, Texas, you're probably not seeing this. You're probably going to be like a flat line, right? So the weather's not really shaping you. But for my friends in Quebec, you know, Minnesota, Michigan, you know, you folks with a really extreme winter to summer difference, this is going to make a big deal for you. And then finally, how do I deal with the overall impact of things like a promotion or things like a, you know, an event hitting my store, whether that's construction, which is kind of negative, or a rodeo, which is really positive. So all of that being put in there so that we can get a better picture of what's going to happen in my store going forward, because that forecast is going to become a key component in our order calculation. Now, as we start to get into the ordering methods, I've been talking a lot about forecasting, so I want to talk about how we do have some different forecasting methods. I'm not going to go through all of them, or different ordering methods. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I kind of want to contrast 2 key ones to talk about the different ways we can order things and the different advantages or disadvantages of them. I've been talking a lot about this forecasted method, and in the forecasted method, we're really setting on today's current order date, looking forward to a period between 2 deliveries. So the delivery that I'm ordering for and the one after that. Now, I don't really care about the stuff after the second delivery in front of me because the next order will pick that one up. But I'm really focused on that window between my delivery that I'm ordering for and the one after that. And a forecasted method basically takes all that really exciting thing, those really exciting things that we just did to produce a really good forecast and say, what do you think I'm going to sell in that time frame? That's really great, and it's probably one of our most sophisticated and most accurate ordering methods. The trick is it requires you have a pretty sufficiently high quantity of data to work with to produce a good forecast. So the question comes up, well, what happens when I don't really feel good about my forecast? Maybe I've got a very little amount of history, or I've got a lot of volatility in my forecast. What do I do then? We got a secondary ordering method that I want to mention called replenishment. Replenishment says if I'm sitting at today's order and I look backwards to my last order, what do I need to undo? So what kind of sales do I need to replace? What kind of adjustments do I need to replace to get back to the exact same place I was last time? Now, like I said, the forecast there, it can anticipate all kinds of things. And so in that way, it's a really good way to produce a solid quality order if you've got the data to produce it. Replenishment in a lot of ways is an alternative to that when we don't have a good source of data, either a not sufficient quantity of data, or we don't really trust the data because there's so much sales volatility. And so we say, okay, let's just get back to where we were as of that last order. The trade-off with that particular method is you've basically said, I don't trust my forecast enough to use that forecast for ordering purposes, so it loses certain on-hand adjustment methods we'll talk about in a little bit. And at the same time, if we're starting to see major changes in our store, we're not going to anticipate those. And at the same time, it kind of assumes your inventory is in a pretty good position already. So it has some really good advantages if we've got some conditions in our data we want to deal with. You're also kind of trading some things off for that. Those different ordering methods are there, and we give you some flexibility so we can make sure we cater those to the right conditions. Now, what I wanted to talk about briefly, though, is that we can dynamically shift between ordering methods depending on conditions that may arise in your items. So, for example, I may have a new item introduced to my store, and in the first few weeks of that item being introduced to my store, I don't necessarily feel real great about that forecast. We got some forecasting adjustment methods where we can deal with new items separately, but what I may say is I really would just like to replace whatever we forced out to that store until I've accumulated about 3 weeks worth of history. We can do that, and then without you having to go change any configuration at all, we can identify the point at which we've accumulated at least 3 or 4 weeks worth of history and shift that item from just being replaced as we go to being something that we forecast and order on the basis of forecast. So not only do we have flexibility in those ordering methods, we've got some ability to change those ordering methods dynamically based on certain conditions that make more sense to use one method or use the other method. On that forecasted method, I just want to kind of briefly show you here the calculation. Once we have a really solid forecast, there may be some complexity that goes into the calculation of that forecast, but once we know that a typical Tuesday looks like this and adjusted for the events on this Tuesday and the seasonal factors for this Tuesday, it looks like that, then really the only question we're really asking is what are the estimated sales between delivery? We'll make some adjustments for over-under stock conditions that we'll talk about here in a second, and then ultimately we say this is how many units you need. The great thing about that method is that it's not any kind of arcane, complex calculation that the stores will never be able to understand. We can start to look at an explanation for why we're ordering something that the store level folks can understand and work with. Now, the other thing that you're seeing here is that factor for adjusting for over-under stock. As we start to talk about adjusting for over-under stock, there's multiple ways we can get to an ideal stock level so that we can produce a better order. Now, this adjustment, if you want to think about it, is really just looking at two different things and saying how different are they. It's saying, what do I have at delivery, and what do I think I ought to have at delivery? Now, if my ought to is lower than what I actually have, then I really don't need to order as much. I need to bring my current inventory levels down. If my ought to is higher than what my current inventory level is, I probably need to add some stuff to my order so I can increase my stock level. So I'm either over or I'm under stock. The trick here is how do we arrive at a place where we can determine what we ought to have in stock currently without driving ourselves crazy or creating a lot of work for ourselves. So there's three main methods that we can use in Enterprise 8 to set those ideal on-hand levels. The first one is called a day's worth. So we'll say minimum days on hand. And if you remember, part of that forecast thing was trying to come up with what's a good Tuesday look like? What does a normal Tuesday look like for this store for that item? What does a normal Wednesday look like? Well, all those things are in terms of a day's worth of consumption. So as I start to talk about using 3 days worth to set my minimum stock levels, that can dynamically and intelligently determine a minimum level for all the items in my store based on the actual performance in that store. What does that mean? That means that it's setting a realistic stock level for most of my items. We'll talk about slow movers here in a second, but for most of my items setting a realistic stock level, and it's doing so in a way that dynamically adjusts to actual changes in what's going on in my store. So if sales increase, Those items that are using 3 days worth, 3 days worth may be a little bit more. Or if my store slows down a little bit, 3 days may be a little bit less. But for the bulk of my items, I can set a minimum level that I didn't actually have to go in and tinker with every item in every site to set the level for. That's an efficiency improvement that helps you sort of achieve the benefits of having an over-under stock adjustment, optimizing our inventory levels, without having to have a full-time employee managing what those levels look like. Now, I mentioned a second ago, that works well if we're doing a forecasted type method. If I trust my forecast enough to order based on it, then I can use a day's worth to determine what my minimum levels look like. If I opt for that replenishment option, in a replenishment context, I've chosen to not actually trust my day's worth, so I'm not going to trust my day's worth for my stock level adjustment either. So there's kind of a trade-off. When you use that replenishment option, you don't get that day's worth. There's two more options, though, for how we can set that minimum stock level. The first one's a minimum quantity, and that's just us coming in and saying, look, for this set of items in this item group, for these top items in these item groups, for these specific items, I've got a minimum inventory level by quantity. Now, where does this come in? If I've got a set of items and 3 days worth fills out the shelf and it covers any buffer stock if I have sales growth, that's great. But I've got a set of facings that I've got to cover so my store doesn't look like CVS after Easter, right? I don't want to look like a Walgreens or a CVS after everybody's come in and done the deal bomb and tried to, rip everything off the shelves. So I want to make sure that I look tidy, that I look neat, that I've got my shelves covered. And I've got a handful of items in my store, though, where if I put 3 or 4 or even 5 or even 100 days worth of that product on the shelf, it's not necessarily going to cover all the facings that I need covered to keep things tidy and neat looking. And in those cases, I can create basically an override that says, look, if 3 days worth isn't enough to cover at least so many units so that the shelves look nice, just use 10 units. Now, that's there, and we can use the days worth and those fixed units in conjunction to very efficiently set those minimums. But we added something in Enterprise 8 for those of you who have this accessible. If you have planogram data so that we've got a good picture of what those shelving requirements look like, we can incorporate those as another factor to set those ideal minimums for us. So very efficiently set those minimum fixed units for us without somebody having to actually maintain those. If you're sitting here and you're thinking, hey, I don't have planogram software, but I'd really like to be able to set these ideal stock levels, what do I do? In those cases, that's where those days worth are going to come in and help you set the bulk of the items, and we can come in and set item level or group level overrides for the minimum quantities to help you kind of clean up after the rest of the stuff. So there's some strategies there, and I just recommend that if you're in that spot where you don't have the planogram, we can work with you to help efficiently set those minimum levels without you having to beat your head against the wall to set individual item level, site level minimums across your items. Right. The other great thing about this minimum stock level in Enterprise 8, there's a lot of questions that have come up traditionally about overstock or understock conditions where stores say, hey, why did it say that I needed to order less? I don't order that much normally. I order a lot more than that normally. Or they say, hey, I usually order a lot less than that. Why is it asking me to order more? We very clearly communicate exactly what those over-understock conditions look like so they can say, hey, look, this nice yellow bar, that's where you're at. You see that red line, that's where you're supposed to be. So a much clearer picture than when we do have an over-understock condition, why we adjusted their order for those conditions. Now, the other factor that I said was one of the components as we tried to get you to that place where we increased your sales, we reduced the out of stocks, and we optimized your inventory, we said we actually have to execute this order, right? So in Enterprise 8, we added a tool called the Order Management Dashboard so that if I'm in charge of a series of stores getting their orders done, I can see what orders they have due and in what status those orders are in. So have they started them? Have they completed them? Is anybody past due? And I can see sort of the store performance level side of it. In that same dashboard, we also let you see the vendor integration side. So if I've got orders that are supposed to be sent off to vendors, I can see which ones have been exported, which ones have been confirmed, which ones are still waiting on confirmation. And basically that big sort of 80,000 foot view of everything that's going on with those orders, and I can drill down into any kind of problems or concerns and say, hey, store 211, you guys haven't finished your order yet, you need to do something about it. Now, if you know anything about PDI, though, you know that our sort of main objective is often to do things in an automated fashion as possible. So we really don't want somebody sitting there watching some dashboard all day long. This is really more a point of reference for somebody who's in a supervisory position. Our probably favorite way to do things is to get into a place where things are done automatically. So for example, as we start to schedule out orders, one of the things we do is we create an entire timeline of certain events that we want to have happen by a certain time frame. Now, you don't have to go define that entire time frame. Those things are set according to sort of relative settings according to when the order's due. But we can identify a point when we need to display a reminder for the store. We can identify a point when the order's due. We can identify a point where the order's past due. We can identify a point where the order's past due enough we're going to do something about it, and we can identify the point at which the order ought to have been exported. Each one of those points we can either do some kind of action to fix it, or we can actually alert people so they can do something to fix it. And that automated process is there to make sure that we never ever miss an order. My favorite one of these though is with Enterprise 8, we added structures to make sure that every order made it out the door, even if there wasn't a human who eventually sort of intervened and did something about it. So we added what was called past due handling. Past due handling allows you to go from any stage of the ordering process to done without somebody actually having to touch it. So if we reach a point where we're 30 minutes past due, somebody doesn't have to go in and do something about it. The system can automatically generate an order based on the suggested quantities if they haven't touched it, or if the store started it but didn't finish it, then we can take that order that they started, either scrap it and start over from scratch, or use what they had to start with. So we got some different tools there to help make sure that those orders actually get completed. There's one more layer that I wanted to talk through as well, and it's not exactly tied into the overall suggested ordering process, except in one area, which is knowing what's on its way to the store currently. We have a lot of folks out there who have a lot of ordering that's going on between the buyers and the sales reps at the vendors, and that's happening kind of over here in this black box. So the suggested ordering doesn't necessarily know that this stuff's on its way, and those people making those decisions don't necessarily have the tools they need to make sure that everything's completely allocated based on actual performance in a given store. Now, if you look at this graphic, what I found as I started talking to more and more people involved in this process is that usually you have either kind of these black box processes that are happening over here that nobody knows exactly what's going on, or you've got this buyer sitting in a chair and getting 500 spreadsheets of 800 different varieties of people trying to tell them, we'd like to send these quantities to these places. What we did in 8 was we really added two main paths that you could pursue. One of those is more of a kind of what you might call a promotional path. So maybe the vendor comes to you and says, I've got so many units of this particular product and I'd love to sell them to you at this particular promotional cost. Then the question comes up, it says, well, where should we send those? Which sites need more of those? Which sites need less of those? We gave you what's called a distribution management tool that allows you to come in and allocate those according to actual site performance. So if we're looking at how many bottles of water do we need to send out because it's coming into June and we've got some really great deals from our wholesaler, then I can actually look at it and see, okay, what do sales look like for that particular product category at actual stores, and make sure that stores that are high performing get more of those without us having to kind of make arbitrary decisions. The other path that we gave you as part of distribution management is the ability to create entire orders from the home office. Now, the goal here isn't so that you're managing the orders completely. The goal is so that if you have a situation, maybe you have a winter storm pop up or a tropical depression coming through, or some special condition where you say, we need to push out a certain amount of product to the stores, we give you the ability to record those, even communicate them onto the vendor, and all of these we give you the ability to anticipate them as pending distributions. So there's one more layer where we can bring more tools to you guys so that you can make intelligent decisions about what your purchase decisions are, but also help the suggested order be that much more accurate by anticipating, hey, I don't need to buy any more bottled water, I have 5 crates on the way. So some great tools there in a new area of the software that we haven't really done anything about that business process in the past, and I think it's going to be a great opportunity for folks. So that's the material we kind of want to talk to you guys about. I know it's been sort of fast and furious. We had a lot of material to cover. Wanted to leave some time though for questions. So we have a chance here to field any of the questions that you guys have been passing over to Austin. So he's going to feed these to me, and I'm going to try and answer as many of these as we can get taken care of. So the question is, what can we do to potentially link items together that are related to each other? And as we started to explore this, there were really quite a few different questions around how we wanted those linkages to behave. And in the end, we came to a place that essentially said those things really need to be sort of participating together in a promotional event. Now, if we have a promo type item, one of the main things that we're going to do with that is obviously we've got the ability to adjust its forecast temporarily. But if we were going to walk through the full life cycle, typically what we would say is, look, we've got this ability to record a distribution from the home office for the introduction of the promotion item in the first place. We have the ability to adjust the forecast going into the promotion for that promotional item. We also have the ability to essentially say, once the promotion's over, have the event cancel out the impact of that entire promotion on all the involved components. Whether we're talking about the cannibalized item that sales went down severely during the promotional period, or that item where the sales went up substantially because it was the promotional item, when that promotion's over, we can essentially reset back to normal. So the question was, we've got retention days set in focal point. what kind of impact does that have on things like the seasonality calculation, which can use multiple years worth of history? The seasonality calculation is actually going straight to item sales in the enterprise company database. So those retention days where we're cleaning up that historical data in the focal point data warehouse, those are not going to have an impact on that seasonal adjustment. So the seasonal adjustment can go to the data that's actually currently not being cleaned up because we've not seen a legitimate reason to pull those sales data out. So we've got access to that data, and your retention days won't be affected at all. We also have some ability where really, if you want to know how much data does it need to produce that seasonal forecast, because of the way that average is working, he uses about 3 years worth of history if it's available. If you've got at least 13 months of history, he can do it with 13 months as well. So the question is, can I turn off the over-under stock adjustment and still have the on-hand available? Now, in the calculation itself, there's no part of the calculation that would use the on-hand other than the over-under stock adjustment, but we did add the ability in Enterprise 8 for you to see the on-hand in all the orders, regardless of whether or not you were actually using the over-under stock adjustment. So the handheld in particular always has access, even on manual orders now, you can actually see the on-hand data on the order details when you actually create the handheld order as well, even if it's just manual and you didn't do a suggestion at all. Now the order calculation, the only part of the order calculation that makes use of the on-hand is the over-under stock adjustment. So the question is, can we import from a wholesaler what our pending distributions are? And absolutely. So, you know, that first path where I said we really had more of a promotional type, and the second path where we were really trying to create a host level order, both of those can either be created and directly posted from that management dashboard, from that distribution management dashboard, or we can take an order file or a distribution file and import those as distributions. So there's two methods essentially to get it in. You could either create it in the system and post it in the system, or you can import any distribution data that you've got accessible. So as long as you can get us either a spreadsheet or a data feed of some kind, we can get it in. And that's a SIMPS-based import, which means all those bazillion different formats that you maybe run into, you could map them, or you could say, hey, actually, we're going to start by you telling me what items you want to distribute. I'll kick out a CSV we can start to work with, and we can export that, and it'll be in the format that we already have available to directly import back in. So we tried to add a little bit of sanity to help you if you wanted to create a starting point template to work with those vendors. But if they give you something, if you can map it through SIMPS, you can get it in as an import. So the question is, what about life cycle things? What about items that are being removed from the store and we want to stop ordering them? Now, any item that is actually being completely shut down, remember we can always turn off the orderable flag on the VIN and indicate that whole VIN is not being orderable anymore. As we start to talk on a site-by-site basis, there's a couple ways that we can actually drop that off. One is that we actually evaluate the history and the activity around that item, and if an item has ceased to be active from a purchase and sales perspective, then we actually will pull that off with a suggestion. That doesn't necessarily deauthorize them where they can't add it to the order, but it does at least stop suggesting for that item. Now on the other side, we're currently in the middle of a project so that we can also use that planogram integration to help orderability. And in that context, what we would actually give you the tools to do is say, hey, if it's on a planogram, it's orderable. If it's not on my planogram, it's not orderable. And that could be set either across an entire order or for a specific group of items under that order. And that one's actually in progress as we speak. So there's a question here that came up, and I want to kind of explain some background on this question first. It said, well, what happens if I change the on-hand during the order? For those of you familiar with Store Assistant 3.7, in 3.7, the order or the on-hand was what the on-hand was, and so the calculation stemmed from that on-hand and resulted from that on-hand. And if the on-hand wasn't a good starting point, there wasn't much you could do while the order was in progress to fix that. What we found was that store-level folks were in a position where they could trust the order more if we let them modify the on-hand and recalculate the order based on the new on-hand, because they could see, oh, the problem here wasn't the order calculation or the system, it was the bad on-hand that I'd fed into it. So we allow the store-level folks to modify that on-hand in transit in the middle of that order, so we can say, hey, you say that I've got 500 and I'm overstocked. Actually, I'm looking at 8 of these on the shelf. That order modification does not actually change inventory, and the reason we did that was because we had a lot of people say, look, I trust my folks to do ordering, I trust them to do this, but we don't let them actually do audits of the inventory. So what we do with that is we record the fact that you overrode the inventory on hand. We can recalculate for the ordering purposes, but what we do is we actually just mark it that happened. We've got an exception audit type rule that says, okay, go out there and sweep up any modifications to the on-hand that have occurred during an order and produce those into what we would call an exception audit. hand them the list and let them go recount anything that they said was wrong in the order. That way, all the feedback we're getting from the ordering process that on-hands are incorrect, we can then get incorporated in inventory by the people who are authorized to modify our inventory. So we got a great question. Is there anything to help us with something like a bridge buy item? So in bridge buys, if I know that we got a lot of different folks who work in different segments of the business. Just to explain that, I've got a great cost promo that's in effect for the next couple of weeks, but then that goes out the 3rd and 4th week. And so how do I make sure that we buy enough for the first few weeks, during the first few weeks, that we don't have to buy any more in that 3rd and 4th week when they're going to increase my cost? The way we got around that, now we don't have any kind of predictive capabilities built in yet. That's still something that we do want to do eventually, where we actually come in and say, look, we've got a promo, the promo ends here, we're going to go and buy through the whole month. What we do instead is we can identify those items that have cost promos, and we tell the store level folks what the expiration date is on it. So we go ahead and flag those things as having cost promos on them and with specific expiration dates, so that they can go into a specific step in the ordering process. It'll list out anything that's got a cost promotion. They can find the ones that got cost promotions coming up in the next few weeks, and if they want to bump up that overall order, they can. So we did want to make it incredibly visible to the store level if you guys want to pursue that, so that they can help do that bridge buying. So that's one option. The other way that we sort of talk through engaging those bridge buy opportunities is that if from the home office you recognize that you're in a bridge buy situation, again, we can look at doing some of those home office type distribution type orders to kind of help supplement those particular items while you're in that promotional phase. So the question is, what happens when I've got multiple different packages on the same item? In those contexts, because of all the sales forecasting data and the unit consumption level data that we've got happens at an item level, if I look at the forecast and I say, how much am I going to sell? Right now, we don't try and break that out by 6 packs versus 30 packs versus whatever, if they're all in the same item. Now, if you break those out into individual SKUs so that you can actually track their sales separately, then we can do that. The other thing, though, that we do have the capability of doing is identifying any of those items that do have alternative VINs, so that they know, hey, we've suggested X based on the amount of units you need, but you may be able to add in a different VIN and basically order both VINs in different quantities to meet your fulfillment. So we don't really try and calculate what's the best combination of all those VINs to get you the right cost. And without tracking the sales separately, we don't have a good picture for how many 6 packs versus 30 packs you're selling. That's something we've got to get the data first, which means there's a little bit of a price book shift that has to happen. But there are some tools to kind of help that weren't there in the 3.7 world. So the question is, can the home office override order quantities for promotions that are coming up? The great thing also about this all being an enterprise is that just the same way that if somebody's working on paperwork at the store level, somebody can go into paperwork at the home office and actually look at the data that they're interacting with even before it's completed. In the same way, if we create an order in Enterprise 8, it's in the same database that all your paperwork's in and all your home office setup's in. It's all living in the same database. So if I'm sitting here, in Temple, Texas, and my stores are spread out and I've got one in Florida that I want to make sure that they order a certain amount, I can go over there and intervene in their order even before it's done or after it's submitted before export, for example. I've got direct access to that data and I can interact with it. Now what I would say though, and kind of one more layer on top of that sort of bridge buying thing, probably a more efficient way to intercept that order and maybe increase the order quantity would be to add what's called a minimum ordering requirement. Now in the past we'd use that primarily for things like rebates, but we tried to build in enough flexibility in this tool in the Enterprise 8 world so that if you just said, hey, coming up on this particular order, everybody has to order at least this much every week for the next 2 weeks because we know that everybody's going to need at least that much, and we want to bump their orders up over the course of the next couple of weeks because week 3 and week 4 are going to be higher costs. So that minimum ordering requirement will let you do a little bit of intervention without having to go into the specific orders and deal with them from there. If you were thinking to yourself, hey, I'm looking at this and I can run a report on everything that everybody's ordered and I want to bump it up a certain amount, you could create also an import file and do it as a distribution as well. So there's a lot of avenues, but you could ultimately get to the same mountain that way. So the question was, how confident are we in the forecast based on actual data? What I would say is that we actually validated a number of different forecasting mechanisms, and there's a lot of people who want to get up in front of folks and talk about, some real kind of $25 words of, least squares linear regression and all this nonsense. And if I sound a little scornful, it's because, here at PDI, I've always kind of loved the fact that there's things that sound real sexy, but if they don't get results, we don't care. And so as we started to present a lot of modeling for this stuff, the biggest question that we always came back to when we presented these forecast models in front of people was, okay, how does it compare to actuals? Unfortunately, we've got lots of you guys working on this stuff. So we've had a lot of actuals we could pull together, and we could start to look at the forecasts versus the actuals and see how they compared. And what we found out was that because of the volatility that's sort of inherent to all the C-store industry, because of the sort of lower volumes that we're working at for certain items, the forecasting models that we were using, which at the end of the day, I'm not going to tell you were some fancy thing, a lot of them are weekday specific averages, they produced more accurate, and I'm not saying accurate in the sense that they always land on exactly the spot, but more accurate in the sense that they produce a generally closer or safer picture than any sort of least squares linear regressions, trend analysis, those kind of plot analyses type statistical methods. As far as a statistical number, I can't say that I know exactly what our standard deviation is off the norm. I would just say that it's the best of all the different models that we looked at. And if you want to know specifically, we actually did build in tools for the sales forecast engine where you can say, hey, I want to calculate this forecast as of a month ago, and then I want to compare it to the week after that in actual terms so I can see how far they are off. And I can then modify certain factors like, do I want to include the seasonal adjustment? Do I want to include event adjustments? And I can see what kind of impacts those things are going to have and see exactly how accurate it is. So we did give you tools so that you could do some more scientific type experimentations with your forecasts to produce the best forecast possible. So the question is, can the minimum orders be set by vendor rather than item? So in other words, it's not that I've got to order X amount of that item, it's rather that I've got to order a specific minimum quantity of any item specifically. What we found with those was that as we started talking to more and more folks, that one came up in a few conversations. The more people we talked to, the more we realized that if they ever ordered under that min and they needed something, that a lot of times it was handled by the vendor's ordering system. If you're in a spot where you find that this is causing you any kind of difficulties, we're happy to talk about it. It's just in the course of multiple years worth of design reviews and discussions, we didn't find anybody who didn't have already a pretty solid workaround for that already. So this is why we just hadn't pursued it. Now, it's not that we can't, and it's not that we won't. We just want to make sure we get a little more information before we chase that one. So the question is, if I needed to add a certain amount of units to a certain item across all the stores, could I do that from the home office? And absolutely. I would do that as a distribution, but I would post it directly into the ordering system so that it didn't see it any different. That would just let me supplement the order without having to actually mess with every single order. But yeah, the distribution management tool, you could essentially come in and say, this item, this quantity, these sites, bang, and it would post it even directly into the same ordering system. If you wanted it to get gathered up in the exact same files that we hand over with your store orders, we can make that happen as well. So we did have a few more questions coming up, generally just about this idea of if I've got two separate items and they have an impact on each other, how do they relate? Again, we have thought through this a pretty good bit. There are multiple tools to help engage that, but just for the sake of time, what we're going to take that conversation offline, make sure you guys get all the information about all the different tools that are available to do that, and we can have that as a separate conversation, but we're totally willing to engage that one, and we'll have that conversation as soon as we can. With all those questions, we're wrapped up. I appreciate you guys taking some time to join us today. Again, I think there's a lot of good tools that are available to you here. Wanted to make sure you knew what they were. Hope you have a fantastic day and a great weekend.